Okay, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Thanksgiving edition of Stories from the Archives. And what we're going to do today, we got several things we're going to cover, but the first one I'm going to share with you. This is one of my favorite paintings, and it's called The Mayflower in Plymouth Harbor. And we all know the story of the Mayflowers, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Mayflower story today. But I love this painting. It was done in 1882. It showed the bleak background of the harbor, uh, cold waves, cold wind, and that kind of thing. What we do know about the what we know about the Pilgrims, it comes from a book called Mort's Relation. And in the 1600s, the word relation meant your story. I'm telling my story, my autobiography. I'm relating it. And so many books will have the term relation. And so this is a relation published later on about about the arrival of the Pilgrim in the harbor. And this note that they left England the 6th of September, leaving Plymouth, England, and they got to America the 9th of November. And so, so there are three what I call miracles. And if you want to think of coincidences as miracles, that can be true. I've heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a coincidence. But there are three things involved in the story that we know of the pilgrims and the pilgrim story that I want to share with you today. The first the first one I call is help from the Welsh. And you probably never heard of why Wales or the Welsh would be a part of the Pilgrim story. But in the 16th century, there was a prevalent legend told that Prince Madoc, a Welsh son of King of North Wales, about 1170 sailed to the west and discovered a new land to the west, a warm land teeming with forest and game. He came back to Wales and put together a group of about 120 people, and they sailed west from Wales and had 10 ships, and he left and was never seen again. And by the time of Columbus's voyage, all traces of this colony had supposedly disappeared. The story went that the Welsh settlers intermarried with the Indian, and their traits were assimilated into Native American culture and so forth. And this legend became captured in bardic poems, and they were told around campfires and passed along by word of mouth. And they finally found their way in print in 1589 in Richard Hakluyt's edition of what he called Principal Navigation and Discovery of the English Nation Made by Sea or Over Land. And he placed a story about Prince Madoc coming to the New World in chapter 3, where he called it the English valiant attempt in searching almost all corners of the vast and new world of America. And he places it in his book, chronological book, just before where Columbus sought King Henry VII's permission to search for the West Indies in 1488. Now, at the time the book is published, England is struggling to become an empire. 1589. It's 100 or more years after the Columbus landing. Sitting on the English throne is a red-headed Welsh woman, Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and she had brought Protestantism back to England. She is surrounded by court counselors. Richard Hakluyt is one of them, who published the book, and also another man named John Dee. And they keep urging Her Highness what she should do is she should also establish colonies in the New World. Why let Spain have all the treasure and the glory? But she's hesitant, because Spain is a world power, and it laid claim to the entire New World by the right of Columbus landing in 1492, and also the Pope issued a papal bull in 1499 noting all of North America, or the America belonged to Spain. and so she worried that anything she might do might spark a war. Now, John Dee, one of her counselors in 1578, gives Her Majesty a list of what he called royal titles to show the chain of title in the New World. Now, we have lost the 1578 manuscript, but there was another copy made in 1580, and on the back of the map, he claimed that the first claimant to the chain of English title to North America, the right of England to North America rather than Spain, occurred in 1170 when Lord Maddock, son of Owen Gwynedd, Prince of North Wales, led a colony and inhabited Terra, Florida, or thereabout. And based on this document, Elizabeth Thurber issued a royal patent for colonization to Sir Humphrey Gilbert, giving him permission to discover and settle heathen land not actually possessed of any Christian prince or people. A 1583 voyage established a colony in Newfoundland. His half-brother Sir Walter Raleigh leads a 1586 company to Roanoke, Virginia. And in 1606, King James I grants a charter to the London Company or the Virginia Company to settle the region between Long Island and Cape Fear. And it is this, right, it is this thing that gives the Plymouth group, the Puritan, the opportunity to travel to the New World. And it's all based on this legend about Prince Madoc. And interestingly enough, for many years, there was a historical marker over here in Mobile Bay noting that this is where Prince Madoc arrived with his colony. And supposedly all trace of the Welsh disappeared. And it was such a prevalent legend that even President Jefferson, when he issued instructions to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the Northwest, one of his instructions was to look for traces of Welsh heritage. And that's another story for another time. But this is kind of the Welsh, this idea of Prince Madoc is one of the first things that lead to the Puritans arriving in America. The second wonderful miracle, I think, that happened was I call the root cellar. And shortly after landing, the Pilgrims began exploring the area around the bay, and they came across a mound of fresh earth some 3 or 4 feet high. And digging into this, they found, quote, a little old basket full of fair Indian corn. And digged further, they found a great basket full of very fair corn of this year with some 36 goodly ears of corn, some yellow, some red, and other mixed with blue, which was a very goodly sight. The basket was round, narrow at the top, and it held about 3 or 4 bushels, which as much as 2 of us could lift up from the ground from their account. Before the long winter is over, the Pilgrim came to recognize that this corn of the Wampanoag Indian was worth more than the gold of the Aztec. And during 1621, the Indian taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn. You began planting when, quote, the leaves of the white oak tree were as large as a mouse's ear. You burned the ground over first and dug with sticks of wood. You created mounds about 3 feet apart, putting in them about 4 kernels of corn after putting in 2 or 3 fish for fertilizer. And you also planted squash, pumpkins, and artichokes. If it had not been for these root cellars that the Pilgrims found and the later cultivation of Indian corn as a staple, the colony probably would not have survived beyond 1621. Now, the Indians had many ways to prepare this maize. One of the most frequent was a stew that they cut up fish, eels, and other meats along with cut up ears of corn and boiled them together. And I've not even mentioned Guanto, but it was the miracle of the root cellar, and discovering the use of corn and maize that saved the colony from starvation. And the third amazing miracle I want to talk about are called help from the library. Now, the first account that we have, and I've mentioned this before, we have the Pilgrims in the Plymouth colony. It's from a little 45-page booklet published in London in 1622. and it's called A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and Proceedings of the English Plymouth Plantation Settled at Plymouth in New England, and so on. It has a 70-word title if you want to be precise about it. It's often called Mort's Relation because in the front of it there is a little thing and it says George Mort. And it does carry the story of what we consider the first Thanksgiving. The only problem was after its publication in 1622, this book was lost for 200 years. People mentioned it. They copied one another. They say, "Oh, the Mort relation talks about the Plymouth plantation," but nobody could put their hands on it. And it was only rediscovered in Philadelphia, in a Philadelphia library in 1820, from 200 years after it was published, and it was finally reprinted in 1841. And there have been many reprinting and transcriptions since that time. But if it may be that at least for the first 200 years, we really didn't have our hand on the actual printed account of the history of the Plymouth colony. The second part of this story of the library, our second major source about the Plymouth colony is a handwritten manuscript by William Bradford. And he described the group's existence and their experiences in Holland as well and the travels and their new world. And they have the passenger list of the Mayflower. And he wrote this sometime between 1630 and 1650. It's considered to be the first American history book ever written. It's known by many names, but librarians use the term Bradford's own title, which is called A Plymouth Plantation. We know he wrote it between the years 1630 and 1650, and it's 270 pages long. This is a handwritten journal in 2 books. And in chapter 6, he told why he wrote this book. "I have been the larger in these things, and shall crave to leave in some passages following. I shall labor to be more contracted, that their children may see with what difficulties their fathers wrestled in going through these things in their first beginning." Now, Bradford never published this manuscript, handwritten book. Instead, he gave it to his son William, who later gave it to his son, Major John Bradford. And a number of New England historians had access to it because they mention it sometimes in their writings, but the book just generally could not be found. Published between 1630 and 1650. We know that Reverend Thomas Prince apparently borrowed the book from Bradford in 1728. And this is at least 100 years after it's written, and put it in the library in the tower of Old South Church, Boston. But sometime after this, it disappeared. It was only rediscovered in the library of the Bishop of London at Fulham, where it was rediscovered in 1855. Again, now 200 years after it was handwritten. And we don't know how it reached London. Most librarians, of course, we know how things move around, but nobody else does. And Life magazine claimed in 1945 that it had been stolen by the British soldier quartered in Boston's Old South Church during the American Revolution. That's a good guess. I mean, it's possible. Now, the British government didn't offer to return the book once it was found, but in August of 1855 it was transcribed and a transcription was sent to Boston. The book is only 12 inches by 7 inches, and between 1860 and 1880 many requests were made of the Bishop of London and the Archbishop of Canterbury asking for the return of the manuscript to America. Finally, in 1897, 240 years after this thing was written, a consistory court met in St. Paul's Cathedral, and after much correspondence, they issued a decree ordering the manuscript be returned at the request of American Ambassador Thomas Francis Bayard. And Bayard delivered the manuscript to Massachusetts Governor Roger Wolcott on May 26, 1897, with a ceremony and a banquet by the American Antiquarian Society. And there was no decision on where to put it, but the governor deposited it at the State Library of Massachusetts, State House, where it still exists today. And this is a page that lists the various Mayflower passengers, and it notes here, for example, one of the entries I have blown up here, and it notes that Ed Winslow, his wife died the first winter, and he married with the widow of Mr. White, and hath two children living by her marriageable, besides sundry that are dead. One of his servants died, as also the little girl, soon after the ship's arrival, but his man, George Sowell, is still living and hath 8 children. So Bradford kept a diary, and it arrived back in Plymouth. And this is the Plymouth ship that in 2011, the Mayflower II, that was built to commemorate the Plymouth and the voyages. And this is the beautiful stamp in 2020 that the post office issued honoring the Mayflower in Boston Harbor. And I think it's just a beautiful, uh, beautiful example showing the lone ship sitting on the shores of this unknown world. Well, it's winter, it's cold, the winds are blowing, the water is cold, and they're alone. And from this beginning, we come with the Plymouth. Now I want to move into my other story that I like to talk about, that I call the Year of the Two Thanksgivings, or no red and blue states this year, only ruffled feathers. Now, in August of 1914 of 1939, at a press conference, remember it's August, it's 8 months into the year 1939, President Roosevelt suddenly expressed his interest in moving the and going to move Thanksgiving on the calendar from November 30th to November 23rd. He noted this would give folks more Christmas shopping. In fact, he was lobbied by business groups that felt that felt it was too closer to Christmas. And so he issued a formal proclamation on October 13th, 1939, saying that the saying that um, saying that the Thanksgiving would be moved. I'm going to give a background, and I skipped over it. I'm sorry. President Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving as a national holiday in 1863, but he established a precedent that the Thanksgiving date would be set by presidential proclamation. And by the time Franklin Roosevelt came to office, came to the White House, Thanksgiving Day had always been set as the last Thursday in November. Unfortunately, in 1939, the calendar had 5 Thursdays, of Thanksgiving would fall on November the 30th. And because the nation was emerging from the Great Depression, a number of business organizations appealed to Roosevelt to move Thanksgiving from the to the fourth Thursday rather than the fifth. And so President Roosevelt issued this proclamation on October the 31st, Halloween, of course, uh, saying that he would move Thanksgiving would now be observed on the 23rd of November, being the fourth Thursday, and not November 30th, the last Thursday of the month. Now that seemed quite harmless enough. You can change the date. But thousands of letters of protest began pouring into the White House. The calendar makers had already printed 1939 calendars. They were sold in January and for Christmas of 1938, and they said Thanksgiving was November the 30th. And the 1940 calendars were already being printed. They also had 5 Thursdays in Thanksgiving, and they were already being sold for Christmas, and they had Thanksgiving as the November 29th in 1940. Well, the calendar makers were outraged. I mean, this is just change. The other problem is most schools had scheduled vacation, colleges had scheduled football games, and some of these years and months in advance. And as the opposition grew, more and more governors said they would observe the traditional day on November 30th. and other governors said we would go along with the president. And so we ended up with a Thanksgiving Day night. Families were torn. Your family in Connecticut might be observing the governor, and therefore their Thanksgiving Day was the 23rd, and your family in New York was observing the presidential, and the one family was observing the presidential proclamation on the 23rd, and the other family was observing the 30th, and they worked for businesses that only had those holidays off, for example. Um, Grocer began planning on stocking two turkey Thanksgiving Day because they didn't know who was going to shop for turkey. Restaurants had to start planning for two separate turkey banquets depending on who would be there. The paper began publishing this thing with the scorecard. And for the white turkey people are observing November the 30th. That is the traditional last Thursday of November. And other people are observing the dark colored one, November 23rd, decreed by the president. And some states just threw up their hands and said, we're doing both of them. You can actually, you can see Colorado, Colorado went along with that, and so forth. Newspapers also have I have another wonderful line of that called Ye Turkey Dilemma, another wonderful chart that a paper published with little graphic, little squares on it of who was observing and who was not observing it. Newspaper began publishing charts of who was observing Thanksgiving on the 23rd, who was observing Thanksgiving on the 30th. In fact, some date, one pundit in the paper began calling it not Thanksgiving, but Franksgiving, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Franksgiving. Floridians and Pensacola were just as confused as everybody else. Florida Governor Fred Cohn proclaimed Thanksgiving Day as November 30th, and the city of Pensacola agreed. The Florida Controller announced that all banks in the state would close on both days, 23rd and the 30th. The Catholic Church priest announced that they also would observe November 30th. The Right Reverend Henry Bell Hoskins of Christ Episcopal Church announced that the Book of Common Prayer said that Thanksgiving was the last Thursday in November or any other day designated by civil authority. He said the governor of Florida was the civil authority in Pensacola, and November 30th would be the appropriate date. And of course, you had the problem of the air bases observing the holiday on the 23rd because the president had decreed that. But they would not have the 30th off when everybody else had the holiday. The Pensacola Post Office, of course, announced that it would observe November the 30th, but they said their rural mail carriers would observe the 23rd. Pensacola schools announced that the schools would be in session on November 23rd, but closed on November 30th and December 1st. The first time in Pensacola history that schools were closed in December for a Thanksgiving holiday. J.C. Penney stores read ads assuring citizens they would be open on November 23rd, but banks, federal offices, the Pensacola Naval Air Station, Fort Branca were all closed on the 23rd. Pensacola High School announced its Thanksgiving Day game set for November 30th would go on. And by the way, they would lose to Birmingham by a score of 30-0 before 4,000 local fans. The Pensacola Journal ran a Thanksgiving editorial on November 23rd, and a Pensacola celebrates its second Thanksgiving on November 30th. B&B Restaurant ran an ad for Thanksgiving dinner with all the trimming for 85 cents on November 22nd. And the ad ran November 22nd for the 23rd and the 29th for those observing the 30th. And you can see from the other thing that happened, all the jelly mate got roast pork for Thanksgiving. Everybody else also had meals available. B&B restaurant, 75 cents, and plate lunches, 75 cents. Thank 7-course Thanksgiving dinner at 50 cents at the Rec Cafe, and so forth. Those were the days. Southern Bell Telephone Company had already had an advertisement locked up. They said they would have long distance rates reduced for Thanksgiving Day on the November 30th. I don't know if they also made them on 23rd. And of course, on Thanksgiving Day, that is the last Thursday of November, November 30th, football went on as planned. And one of my favorite things is this editorial cartoon that read in the Pensacola Journal. And the boy said, "Gee, just think we could have 2 Thanksgivings this year if we wanted to." And the other boy says, "You ain't seeing double, are you? I only see 1 turkey." Roosevelt observed this next to last Thanksgiving, Thursday Thanksgiving, for 2 more years, but public outrage finally caused Congress to pass a law on December 29, 1941, declaring that Thanksgiving Day would be lawfully observed on the fourth Thursday of November of every year. And of course, that's regardless of whether there are 5 Thursdays. The House bill actually specified the last Thursday of November, but it was amended in the Senate to say the fourth Thursday. And House Joint Resolutions do have the effect of law if they pass both chambers and are signed by the President. And so President Roosevelt signed this House Joint Resolution into law on December 26, 1941. And that, and 1940 and 41 were the years of the 2 Thanksgiving. Well, I hope some of my stories from the archive today have entertained you, and you've learned a little bit about some of the background and some of the facts that we talk about when we talk about Thanksgiving. And we're going to eventually come up with another month that we have 5 Thursdays, and when that happens, you'll remember which Thanksgiving to celebrate it on. And so thank you for listening today, and happy Thanksgiving from all of us at the John C. Pace Library and the Archives in West Florida History Center. And thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, you could put them in the chat. I'll be happy to answer them. Or speak up. I could hear you too. Okay. Well, thank you, and I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving next week. Okay. Bye bye.